On a Monday morning in March of 2005, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Jane Miller woke up at her home in Ohio. She yawned and stretched, feeling well rested after a relaxing weekend. The previous day, she'd gone to church with her family, then out to breakfast at their favorite diner, and she'd spent the rest of the day picking up around her house at a very leisurely pace. But after Jane sat up in her bed and rubbed her eyes and then opened them again, she yelped in shock. There, floating directly over her, was a disembodied head. Jane frantically reached over to her nightstand and grabbed her glasses. She slid them up her nose and looked again, hoping to see something different, i.e., not a floating face. But nope, it was definitely a floating face hovering right near the ceiling. And this face, in addition to being very odd because it's floating around in a room, also just looked totally bizarre. The head was shaped almost like a football, and it had piercing eyes and these yellowed buck teeth, and the face stared down at Jane with a hint of malice in its expression. Jane was obviously terrified. She leapt out of bed and raced downstairs to get away from this ghost in her room. Adrenaline was coursing through Jane's body as she fought to catch her breath, and when she reached the kitchen, she whipped around, and luckily, the ghost face was now gone. It had not followed her. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and called her older sister, Melissa. She knew that if anybody would believe this story, it would be her big sister. 10 minutes later, Melissa flew down the street towards her sister's house, risking a speeding ticket in this residential neighborhood to get to Jane's house faster. She pulled into Jane's driveway and threw the car into park, and then ran up the walkway to Jane's house. The moment Melissa stepped inside of Jane's house, immediately something felt off. She couldn't explain it. There was just a coldness in the air. She called out for Jane and found her sister in the kitchen, still in her PJs, sitting in front of an uneaten bowl of cereal. It had been sitting there so long that the Cheerios were bloated and soggy. Jane looked up at Melissa, but her eyes were distant and her face was pale and scared as she whispered that the faces were now above her and beside her and everywhere else she looked. Melissa glanced around, but all she saw was the empty kitchen and her sister sitting there with her soggy bowl of cereal. And so Melissa just asked Jane, like, "Hey, are you feeling okay?" And Jane nodded and said, "I'm not crazy, I'm telling you the truth." And suddenly Melissa just felt so bad for Jane, and she assured her that, you know what, everything's gonna be fine. She told Jane, "I don't think you're crazy," but inside, Melissa thought, oh my goodness, something mentally could be wrong with her. And that's when a realization dawned on Melissa, and she felt a chill run up her spine. Melissa had read about this kind of thing on Facebook, and she knew exactly who she needed to call. The next day, Melissa was back at Jane's house, anxiously anticipating the arrival of her guest. Just then, she heard a knock at the door, and Melissa raced over to greet Father Raymond Smith. He'd been the pastor at Melissa's church for almost 15 years, and Melissa hoped he'd be able to help Jane. Melissa thanked Father Smith for coming over on such short notice, and she explained how worried she was for Jane, and invited him to follow her upstairs to Jane's bedroom. Father Smith smiled and told Melissa that whatever was going on with her sister, they would get to the bottom of it. Melissa crept up the stairs to Jane's bedroom with the sound of Father Smith's footsteps right behind her. And right as Melissa reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner into Jane's bedroom, a wave of icy cold seemed to hit her. To Melissa, it immediately seemed like malicious presences were hovering all around her sister, and they didn't like it when Melissa was in the room. Jane was lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her face. Melissa knew her sister had her eyes closed under there because pitch darkness made it harder to see all the menacing faces all around her. Melissa quietly told Jane that help had finally arrived, and Jane, when she heard this, threw back the covers to see who was there. She blinked and said hello to Father Smith, though she was clearly surprised to see him there. Melissa smiled to herself because this had been her intention, to make sure the creatures that were menacing Jane had no idea who was coming over here. Melissa turned to Father Smith and invited him to begin. Then Melissa stood to the side while Father Smith shook Jane's hand and asked her to explain to him what had been going on over the past couple of days. Jane was a little embarrassed as she began to describe what she was seeing and what she was feeling, but Father Smith didn't actually seem to be listening. Instead, he was studying Jane's hands very carefully, and he was watching her expression and all of her bodily movements, and Melissa even wondered, what was he doing? Finally, after Jane stopped explaining what was going on with her, Father Smith told Jane why he was there. He said her sister, Melissa, had called him yesterday, worried that Jane was suffering from demonic possession. Melissa nodded in the corner. From the moment Jane had described the hallucinations to her, Melissa suspected that a dark entity was possessing her sister, and so she'd called Father Smith in the hopes that he could identify the demons and maybe perform an exorcism to get rid of them. Father Smith was the most devout priest Melissa had ever met. If he couldn't banish the demons back to hell, it was doubtful anybody else could. Except when Father Smith spoke again, he looked at Melissa and told her that he actually wasn't sure there were any demons to banish here. He explained that as Jane was speaking, he'd been trying to see if she had full control of her body, and from what he could tell, Jane was fully in charge of her movements. He hadn't seen any of the involuntary twitches or tics that typically accompany demonic possession. Then the father looked back at Jane and asked her to follow the movement of his finger as he whirled it all around in front of her. Father Smith just shook his head as he watched Jane follow his finger flawlessly, and then Father Smith said that, in his opinion, Jane needed to see a doctor, not an exorcist. Melissa was sort of dumbfounded and asked Father Smith if he was absolutely sure, and Father Smith said that, yeah, the dead giveaway to him at least was that Jane knew her hallucinations were not real. But Father Smith promised that if doctors could not figure out what was wrong with Jane, well, the church would call a certified exorcist who was properly trained within the Catholic Church, and that exorcist could examine Jane's psychological state and determine whether she was genuinely possessed or not. Melissa decided this was a good compromise and agreed to take Jane to a hospital right away. Father Smith thanked her and then offered to pray over Jane before he left. Melissa said that would be nice and prayed silently as Father Smith recited a blessing with his hands outstretched. Three days later, Dr. Randall Crane stood in a hospital room with Jane, watching her sketch a little doodle on his notepad. Dr. Crane was an internal medicine resident at the hospital, and Jane was the most fascinating patient he'd had in a long time. She'd been suffering from these crazy hallucinations for the past few days and was scared that she was losing her mind. Now, Crane didn't know if that was actually true, that she was losing her mind, but he could not explain why she was hallucinating faces all the time, and so he couldn't rule out some form of dementia. And so Dr. Crane, kind of on a whim, had asked Jane to go ahead and sketch on his notepad what she was actually seeing, like draw the face. And so Jane finished sketching and handed the notebook back to Dr. Crane, and she warned him that she was no artist, but this is really what she was seeing floating over her head right now and all the time. Dr. Crane looked down at the doodle that Jane had drawn. The so-called demon face had an oblong, football-shaped head with big buck teeth and round, bulging eyes. It looked more like a Muppet than a monster. In all honesty, it actually reminded him of the main character in an old children's cartoon called Hey Arnold that the doctor had watched all the time when he was a kid. But even if the sketch was sort of funny, he took Jane's condition very seriously. He clearly understood why she'd be terrified to see something like this following her around all the time. And so Dr. Crane asked Jane a few questions, like whether these hallucinations had spoken to her, or if she was experiencing headaches, fever, or seizures around the time these hallucinations appeared, and she said no to all of them. And so Dr. Crane told Jane not to worry. He was going to order some routine blood work to see if maybe she had an infection, and he also ordered a toxicology screening just to rule out any bad drug interactions. An hour later, Jane sat on the examination table feeling very anxious. Dr. Crane told her that all her tests had come back normal, which actually initially made Jane more nervous. She wondered if now she and Melissa would have to call that certified exorcist after all. But Dr. Crane did not seem like he was totally confused. He actually said, "Jane, I want to look at your eyes more closely." And so Jane leaned forward and then followed Dr. Crane's instructions as he first tested her peripheral vision and then also her forward eyesight. And then afterwards, Dr. Crane informed Jane that she had a couple of small blind spots in her vision that he had just discovered that made him want to examine her retinas a bit more closely. Dr. Crane took a little vial of liquid out of his white coat pocket and then told Jane to look straight up. He was going to dilate her retinas, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye that transmits what we see to the brain. The doctor would first pour a little of that liquid into her eyes, and then he would use a device called an ophthalmoscope to shine some light on her retinas and get a better look at what was going on. And so as the liquid made her eyes become more sensitive, the light from the ophthalmoscope stung a bit, but Jane did her best to stay still as Dr. Crane looked at her retinas. And then finally, Dr. Crane switched off the ophthalmoscope and he smiled. He would order a CT scan to confirm his theory, but He was pretty sure he knew exactly what was going on. And 2 hours later, the CT scan confirmed Dr. Crane's suspicion. He told Jane that he'd seen some tiny yellow tissue deposits behind her retinas. These are a sign that her retinas are deteriorating, a condition called macular degeneration. It happens to lots of people as they age. Their eyesight gets worse, and because of that, the brain gets less visual information from their eyes. Now, most people with macular degeneration end up with nothing more serious than slightly blurrier eyesight. But in about 10% of cases, the brain tries to compensate for the lack of information by making up new visuals. For reasons that are still not clear, many of these people who are in this 10% see floating faces. It's very rare, but the symptoms are so consistent amongst patients who suffer from it that Dr. Crane immediately understood what Jane's problem was the moment he saw her drawing that football-shaped head doodle. 3 months after her diagnosis, Jane was unfortunately still having hallucinations, but they were growing more infrequent. Dr. Crane told Jane that while there was no treatment, the hallucinations can stop over time as the brain becomes more accustomed to vision loss. And at the very least, Jane could rest assured knowing that she was not possessed by a demonic entity, and she wasn't losing her mind either. She just had a very creative brain.